It was the beginning of summer, the kind of day when the air feels soft and the sky is so blue it almost looks painted. A father loaded his old pickup truck with fishing rods, a small tackle box, and a cooler filled with sandwiches his wife had made early that morning. His young daughter, barely 10 years old, bounced around the yard with excitement. She wore her favorite cap, a little too big for her head, and clutched her fishing pole like it was a treasure. For her, this was not just a fishing trip. It was an adventure with her father, something she had been waiting for all week. Neighbors saw them leave that morning. Some waved as the truck rolled down the road, dust rising behind it. The daughter leaned out the window, waving back with a smile so bright that even the grouchy man down the street couldn't help but grin. No one could have guessed that it would be the last time anyone in town saw them together. The lake they were heading to wasn't far. It was a place families often went for quiet weekends, a place filled with memories of picnics, campfires, and lazy afternoons. But it also had its secrets. The water was wide, calm on the surface, but locals knew that some parts were tricky. The currents near the creek mouth were strong, and if someone wasn't careful, the water could turn dangerous in a matter of minutes. Still, for most families, it was just a peaceful spot to fish and relax. The father loved fishing. He wasn't the best at it, but that never mattered. For him, it was about slowing down, escaping the noise of daily life, and sharing moments with his daughter. She had been asking questions about fishing for months: how to bait a hook, how to cast properly, how to know if a fish was nibbling. He promised her he'd teach her everything in one trip. That promise was what got her so excited that morning, as if she was finally going to be part of her father's world. By late afternoon, when they hadn't returned, no one worried right away. Families often stayed longer by the lake, sometimes until the stars came out. The mother kept glancing at the clock, though. By nightfall, when the truck still hadn't pulled into the driveway, she stepped outside, scanning the road, her heart heavy with a feeling she couldn't explain. Hours passed. She called a neighbor, asking if anyone had seen them drive back. No one had. Fear began to crawl into her chest. She dialed the sheriff's office, her voice shaking as she explained that her husband and daughter had gone fishing but hadn't come home. Deputies drove out to the lake. Their flashlights cut through the darkness as they searched. The father's pickup truck was parked near the trail leading down to the water. The keys were missing, the doors were locked. The cooler was inside, empty of sandwiches, but still holding a few cans of soda. Everything looked normal except for one thing. There was no sign of the father or his daughter. Search teams were called in. Boats moved slowly across the lake, their motors humming in the silence of the night. Divers went into the water, scanning for any clue. Dogs sniffed along the banks. But there was nothing. No clothing, no fishing rods, not even footprints that could be traced. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The next morning, the mother sat on her porch, surrounded by neighbors who brought coffee, blankets, and quiet comfort. She stared at the empty road, hoping the truck would suddenly appear, that her husband and daughter would walk through the door laughing about an overnight adventure. But deep inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. Days turned into weeks. News crews came to the small town, setting up cameras by the lake, telling the story of the missing father and daughter. Volunteers from nearby towns joined the search. Helicopters circled the woods, their blades chopping the sky. But the harder they searched, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. People in the town couldn't stop talking about it. At the diner, old men who spent their lives fishing argued over what might have happened. Some believed the boat had tipped, and the current pulled them away. Others whispered about darker possibilities, stories too painful for the family to hear. For the mother, every theory was a dagger. She didn't want guesses. She wanted the truth. After months of searching, the official investigation slowed down. Authorities had no leads, no evidence, nothing to follow. The case was declared cold. The mother refused to give up, though. Every morning she left the porch light on, hoping it would guide her family back. Every night she dreamed of her daughter's laughter and woke up with tears in her eyes. The disappearance changed the town in quiet ways. Families who once camped near the lake stopped going. Parents warned their kids not to wander too close to the creek. Even the sound of the water seemed heavier, as if it carried the weight of a secret it refused to share. For the daughter's friends at school, it was heartbreaking. They kept her desk untouched for weeks. Some of them wrote letters and left them at the lake, tied to small stones so they wouldn't blow away. They didn't fully understand, but they felt the emptiness her absence had left behind. As the years passed, the story became a part of the town's history. New families moved in and heard whispers about the father and daughter who had disappeared on a simple fishing trip. The old truck was eventually towed away, but people remembered where it had been found. The trail by the water became known as a place you didn't walk alone after dark. The mother grew older, but her hope never completely faded. On anniversaries, she returned to the lake, carrying flowers, sometimes sitting for hours by the water's edge. She talked to them, as if they could hear her, telling them about the seasons they missed, about how the world had changed, about how much she loved them. What made the disappearance so haunting was not just the mystery of where they went, but the way it happened on an ordinary day in an ordinary place, during something as innocent as a fishing trip. It reminded people how fragile life can be, how quickly everything can change, and how some questions never seem to have answers. Even after 9 years, the story wasn't forgotten. The memory of that little girl's bright smile as she waved from the truck window still lived in the minds of those who saw her that day. The father's quiet determination to give his daughter a happy day by the water still lingered in the stories neighbors told. The truth, hidden beneath years of silence, was still waiting to be discovered. 9 years is a long time, but for the mother it often felt like yesterday. Every morning she woke up and the first thing she saw was the photo on her bedside table. Her husband with his arm around their little girl, both smiling at the camera, both looking so alive. That photo was both her comfort and her pain. It reminded her of what she had lost, but it also kept hope alive that maybe somehow they were still out there. The town had moved on in its own way. Children who had been in school with the little girl were now teenagers, some even preparing for college. People who once joined search parties now only mentioned the disappearance in quiet tones, usually when new families asked about why the lake seemed so empty compared to years before. To many, it was an unsolved mystery that had faded into the background, but for the mother, it was the center of her life, a wound that never healed. Every year on the anniversary of the day they left for the fishing trip, she lit 2 candles in her front window. Neighbors knew what the candles meant. Some came by to sit with her in silence. Others left flowers on her porch. The gesture was kind, but none of it filled the emptiness inside her home. She still cooked too much food out of habit, as if one day her husband and daughter might walk through the door hungry after a long day. There were times when she thought about moving away. Friends suggested it gently, telling her that maybe a new place would help her start fresh, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The town was filled with memories, good ones and bad ones. The swing in the backyard where her daughter once laughed, the chair at the dinner table where her husband always sat, even the path that led to the lake. To outsiders, these were ordinary things. To her, they were pieces of a life she wasn't ready to let go. In those 9 years, the police received tips now and then. A fisherman claimed he saw something floating far out in the lake. A hiker reported strange noises near the creek. Each time the mother's heart raced, only to sink again when nothing was found. Hope kept rising and breaking like waves against a shore. The daughter's friends tried their best to keep her memory alive. On what would have been her 13th birthday, they gathered at the school playground. They tied balloons to the fence, wrote little notes, and shared stories of how she used to make everyone laugh with her silly jokes. One of them said she believed the girl was still out there somewhere, just waiting to be found. Their voices cracked with emotion, but they still held on to that belief. The father's absence was felt too, though in a quieter way. People remembered him as a hard worker, a man who loved his family. At the hardware store where he once shopped, workers still talked about how he was always patient, never in a rush, and always had a smile. His fishing buddies stopped going to the lake altogether. It didn't feel the same without him, and the water carried too many memories. The lake itself seemed to change. Families no longer gathered there for weekend picnics. The laughter of children was replaced by silence. Some said the place felt cursed. Others believed it was simply haunted by unanswered questions. On windy nights, when the water rippled against the shore, a few locals swore they could hear faint echoes of voices, though they knew it was just their imagination. For the mother, the hardest moments were the quiet ones. At night, when the house was still, she would find herself listening for the sound of footsteps on the porch or the creak of her daughter's bedroom door. She prayed every evening, not for riches or comfort, but for the truth. Even if the truth was painful, she wanted it. Not knowing was the cruelest part of all. News crews returned every few years to cover the story again. Reporters stood by the lake, reminding viewers of the father and daughter who went missing on what should have been an ordinary day. Each time, the mother agreed to speak, though her voice trembled with grief. She shared memories of her family, spoke about her hope, and asked the world not to forget. She believed that maybe someone, somewhere, might remember something that could bring her answers. As the years passed, life around her changed. New families moved into town, children grew up, buildings were renovated. But inside her heart, time stood still. She still pictured her daughter as a little girl, still heard her giggle, still remembered how she skipped down the driveway with her fishing pole. She couldn't imagine her as a teenager, because that life had been stolen. Despite the weight of her sorrow, she carried herself with quiet strength. Neighbors often admired her for it. They would say, "I don't know how she keeps going." She kept going because she had no other choice. She kept going because she still believed that one day something would surface, something that would explain what happened that day by the lake. 9 years is long enough for people to forget, but the town never fully did. The story had a way of sticking, like a shadow that followed them. Children who grew up after the disappearance still heard about it from their parents. Some avoided the lake entirely, while others went there secretly, daring each other to walk the trails at night. They weren't alive when it happened, but the fear and mystery lived on in whispers. Every so often, when the weather was clear, the mother would drive to the lake and sit on a bench near the water. She would watch the ripples, the way the sun glistened on the surface. She would close her eyes and imagine her husband teaching their daughter how to cast a line, both of them laughing when the hook got stuck in the weeds. For a moment, it felt real. Then she would open her eyes, and the silence of the lake reminded her of the truth. Nothing had changed, and she was still waiting. The silence of those 9 years wasn't empty, though. It was heavy, filled with questions. People wondered how two people could vanish without a trace. They wondered if the water was hiding something, or if the woods held secrets that no one had uncovered. Even when the search was long over, the mystery kept pulling at the edges of their thoughts. For the mother, each year without answers was another year of carrying a weight that never lightened. She didn't want wealth, she didn't want recognition, she just wanted to know where her family had gone. And while the world seemed to have moved on, destiny had its own plan. 9 years later, on a day that began like any other, 3 children playing near a creek would stumble across something half buried in the earth. Something that had waited in silence all this time, something that would finally begin to reveal the truth. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day when children wander outside because the house feels too small. 3 kids from the neighborhood decided to explore the woods behind their street. They weren't looking for anything in particular, just adventure. The kind of adventure that makes childhood summers unforgettable. The air was warm, the sound of crickets filled the trees, and the creek that ran through the woods sparkled in the sunlight. The creek had always been a place of curiosity. It twisted and turned behind the trees, sometimes shallow enough to step across, other times deep enough to make parents nervous. The children followed it without much thought, tossing stones into the water, chasing dragonflies, and laughing at the way their voices echoed between the trees. They had no idea that this ordinary afternoon would turn into something that people in their town would talk about for years. As they wandered further along the creek, one of them noticed the ground looked different ahead. A section of earth near the bank had caved in slightly, as if heavy rain had washed some of the soil away. It wasn't unusual after storms, but the kids were curious. They moved closer, peering into the small collapse. At first, all they saw was wet dirt and tangled roots. Then, sticking out just slightly from the mud, they noticed a corner of something metal. One of the children bent down and brushed away the dirt with his hands. The metal was rusty, rough to the touch, but it was shaped like a box. Excitement ran through them instantly. Kids always dream of finding hidden treasure, and here was something buried right in front of them. They dug with their hands, pulling away the damp earth until the object was clearer. It was a small box, heavy, covered in rust, and sealed tight. They tried to lift it out together, grunting as the mud sucked at the bottom. Finally, with one strong tug, the box came free, landing on the grass with a dull thud. They stared at it in silence, their hearts pounding. It didn't look like a toy or something left behind recently. It looked old, forgotten, like it had been waiting there for years. One of the children ran his fingers across the top and found the faint outline of a latch. With a little effort, they managed to pry it open. The lid creaked, the hinges stiff from years of being buried. Inside, instead of coins or jewelry like they had imagined, were a few simple objects. A small ribbon, faded and dirty but still recognizable as something a child might have worn. A folded piece of paper, water-damaged and fragile. And at the bottom, a small camera, the kind people used before cell phones made them unnecessary. At first, the kids didn't understand what they were looking at. The ribbon could have been from anyone. The paper was too fragile to unfold without tearing, and the camera looked broken. But the discovery felt important, heavier than they expected. They carried the box back through the woods, their voices buzzing with guesses about what they had found. When they reached home, they showed it to their parents. The adults froze the moment they saw the items. They recognized the ribbon instantly. It matched the one the missing girl had worn in a photo that had been printed in newspapers years ago. The camera, though damaged, could hold more than dirt. It might hold answers. The parents quickly called the authorities, who arrived that evening to examine the box. The atmosphere in town shifted overnight. For 9 years, there had been silence. No sign, no trace of the father and daughter who vanished. Now suddenly, a box buried by the creek had appeared, carrying objects tied to them. People gathered outside their homes, whispering to each other, waiting for updates. The mother, when she heard the news, clutched her chest and wept. For her, it was the first real piece of evidence in almost a decade. Investigators handled the box with care. They sealed the ribbon in the paper, noting how time and water had worn them down. But their focus was on the camera. It was scratched, dirty, and rusted in places, but the memory card inside was still there. Specialists worked carefully to clean it, unsure if anything could be recovered. When the first images appeared on a computer screen, silence filled the room. The photos began normally. A smiling father holding up a fishing rod, his daughter sitting beside him on a small boat, grinning proudly as she held the line. The pictures were blurry in parts, but they told a story of a happy afternoon. As the photos continued, the mood changed. The boat seemed lower in the water. One image showed ripples splashing against the side, higher than before. Another showed the father leaning forward, his face tense as if he was trying to steady something. The daughter looked nervous, her eyes wide. The final photos were the hardest to see, a blur of water rushing, the camera tilted sideways, a hand gripping the edge of the boat, then nothing but streaks of movement and splashes as if the camera had fallen into the water during chaos. Those images were not just photos. They were a window into the last moments of a father and daughter's lives. For the investigators, they were heartbreaking but important. For the mother, they were both painful and relieving. Painful because they showed fear and struggle. Relieving because they gave answers after years of silence. News spread quickly. The discovery of the box and the photos filled every conversation in town. People who had avoided the lake for years returned, standing by the water with tears in their eyes. Some placed flowers by the shore, whispering prayers for the father and daughter. The 3 kids who found the box were suddenly at the center of attention. Neighbors praised them for their curiosity, for not ignoring what they had found. They had given the town something that years of searching hadn't managed to uncover. Without meaning to, they had become part of a story much bigger than themselves. The creek where the box was found became a place people visited, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was proof that even after 9 years, the truth could still come to light. The ground that gave way to reveal the box felt almost symbolic, as if the earth itself had decided it was time to share its secret. For the mother, holding the ribbon in her hands was almost unbearable. She remembered tying it into her daughter's hair that morning, watching her skip toward the truck with excitement. The ribbon had survived years of mud and water, but it carried the memory of a moment she would never forget. She pressed it against her heart, tears streaming down her face, whispering words only a mother could understand. The discovery didn't answer everything. It didn't explain why the boat had struggled, or exactly where the father and daughter's lives ended that day. But it gave a direction, a path to follow. Investigators began searching the creek more carefully, using the photos as clues. For the first time in years, there was progress. The town, once weighed down by unanswered questions, felt a shift. People who had lost hope began to believe again, not in miracles, but in the power of truth. The father and daughter had not simply vanished into thin air. They had left behind pieces of their story, pieces that, thanks to 3 children on a summer afternoon, had finally been found. And though the mystery was not yet fully solved, Everyone knew this was the beginning of the end of silence. The box had changed everything. For 9 long years there had been nothing but silence and questions, but now there were clues, real clues that could be touched, studied, and followed. The camera especially became the center of attention. Investigators handled it carefully, treating it like gold, because they knew it might hold the answers everyone had been waiting for. Experts worked day and night to recover every possible image from the memory card. The first batch of photos had already shaken the town, showing the smiling faces of the father and daughter, and then the frightening moments when the boat began to sink. But the specialists believed there might be more hidden in the card's damaged files. After hours of effort, they managed to pull out several additional images. One photo showed the father's jacket lying across the seat of the boat, soaked with water. Another showed the little girl holding her fishing rod proudly, a fish dangling from the line. These small moments painted a heartbreaking story. The day had started with joy, just an ordinary fishing trip filled with laughter. But then the mood shifted. Another recovered picture showed water sloshing against the inside of the boat, rising fast. The father's hand could be seen gripping the edge, his knuckles tight. The last series of images were almost impossible to look at. Blurred water rushing, streaks of sky, and then darkness. These photos confirmed what many had suspected, that the father and daughter had been pulled into trouble while out on the lake. But it wasn't enough to know that something had gone wrong. People wanted to know why. Why had the boat taken on water? Why hadn't anyone found them after so many searches? Investigators returned to the creek and the areas surrounding the lake. They brought in divers again, even though years had passed. The photos gave them new points to focus on. They studied the current where the creek fed into the lake. Locals had always warned that it was strong, but now it became clear just how dangerous it could be. Underneath the surface, jagged rocks and tangled roots created a trap. If someone was caught there, escape would have been nearly impossible. As the divers searched, the town held its breath. Crowds gathered by the water's edge, watching in silence as boats moved slowly across the surface. Every time a diver went under, people whispered prayers. Every time a diver came up, eyes searched their hands, waiting for news. It was on the 3rd day of searching that they found something. Deep in the current, lodged between rocks, was a piece of metal that matched the frame of a small boat. Time had worn it down, water and mud covering most of it, but the shape was still clear. When it was pulled up, the air was filled with gasps. It was the boat the father and daughter had taken out that day. The discovery of the boat brought fresh waves of grief and relief. For years, the question of what happened had haunted everyone. Now, with the boat in front of them, the truth became harder to deny. The water hadn't given them a chance. Inside the boat, among the mud and debris, investigators found pieces of fishing gear and a small tackle box. The items were corroded but recognizable. One object, a child's shoe, broke the hearts of everyone present. It was proof, painful proof, of who had been there. The mother was informed gently. When she saw the boat, she broke down, her hands covering her face. For years she had prayed for answers, but seeing the reality in front of her was almost too much to bear. Yet through her tears, she whispered that at least now she knew. At least now she could stop imagining endless scenarios and start grieving with the truth. The town gathered that evening for a candlelight vigil by the lake. People stood shoulder to shoulder, holding flickering lights in the dark. Some cried softly, others bowed their heads. Stories were shared. Memories of the father's kindness, of the daughter's bright smile, of how they had touched so many lives in such simple human ways. The vigil was not only for mourning, but also for gratitude. Gratitude that after 9 years, the truth was finally coming to light. The 3 children who had found the box were there too, their faces lit by the glow of candles. They hadn't set out to solve a mystery, but they had become part of it. People hugged them, thanked them, told them they had done something incredible. Their parents stood proudly nearby, overwhelmed by the role their children had played in uncovering the truth. The recovered evidence was carefully studied. Specialists explained that sudden shifts in water level, combined with the unstable design of the small boat, likely caused it to fill too quickly. Once it tilted, the rushing current near the creek mouth dragged it down. The father had tried to save his daughter. That much was clear from the way he was positioned in the photos. But nature had been stronger than his efforts. Hearing this explanation didn't erase the grief, but it gave everyone something solid. The endless rumors, the wild theories, the whispers of darker possibilities, all of it was silenced by the truth. This was not foul play. It was not a mystery born of malice. It was a tragic accident, one that no one could have predicted. For the mother, the knowledge didn't end her sorrow, but it changed it. She could now picture the final moments not as an unknown horror, but as a desperate father fighting to save his child. She could honor that truth, painful as it was, instead of imagining endless questions. The town slowly began to heal. The lake, once avoided, started to see visitors again. Families returned not because they had forgotten, but because they wanted to reclaim it from the shadow of fear. Signs were placed near the creek, warning about the dangerous currents, a reminder of what had happened and a step to protect others in the future. The mother held a private ceremony by the water. She released flowers into the current, watching them float gently away. She spoke softly as if her family could hear her, telling them how much she loved them and how deeply she missed them. She promised she would keep their memory alive, not with sorrow alone, but with stories of their laughter, their kindness, and their joy. The evidence uncovered from the box and the boat was placed carefully in safekeeping. Some of it was returned to the mother, who chose to keep only the ribbon and the camera. She placed the ribbon in a glass frame and kept it in her living room, a symbol of her daughter's innocence and the love that would never fade. The community, once weighed down by uncertainty, found a sense of peace. It wasn't the ending anyone had wanted, but it was an ending. After years of silence, the truth had been spoken. The father and daughter were no longer just missing. They had a story, one that could now be honored properly. And though the sorrow remained, the discovery reminded everyone of something powerful. Even when years pass, even when hope feels like it's gone, sometimes the truth still finds a way to surface. Sometimes the earth itself seems to decide it's time for secrets to be revealed. And when that happens, healing, however painful, finally begins. The search for truth had stretched over nearly a decade, and now, finally, the pieces had fallen into place. The box by the creek, the photos from the camera, the boat pulled from the depths, all of it had given the town and the grieving mother the answers they had long prayed for. But even with the truth revealed, the story didn't simply end. What came next was about healing, remembrance, and finding peace after years of pain. The mother, who had lived in shadows for so long, now found herself stepping into a different kind of grief. It was no longer the uncertainty that tore at her. She didn't wake up each morning wondering if her husband and daughter were out there somewhere, waiting to be found. She now knew where their story had ended. That knowledge, painful as it was, carried its own form of relief. She held a memorial service, not just for herself, but for the entire community. People gathered in the town square, standing shoulder to shoulder, some holding flowers, others holding candles. The atmosphere was heavy with sorrow, but also filled with love. For years, the missing father and daughter had been frozen in memory as a question mark, a mystery no one could solve. Now they were remembered as who they truly were, a man who adored his family and a little girl whose laughter could brighten any room. The service was simple. People spoke one by one, sharing their memories. A neighbor recalled how the father always stopped to help when someone's car broke down. A teacher remembered the little girl's bright curiosity and the way she always raised her hand, even when she wasn't sure of the answer. A friend of the family talked about how the pair had been inseparable, how the father's eyes lit up every time he looked at his daughter. When it was her turn to speak, the mother's voice trembled, but she stood tall. She said that for 9 years she had prayed for answers, and now she finally had them. She admitted that the pain would never truly go away, but she wanted to carry her family's memory forward with love instead of only sorrow. Her words brought tears to many, but also comfort. It was clear that even in her heartbreak, she had found a kind of strength that inspired everyone listening. After the service, the community walked together to the lake. The water was calm that evening, the surface reflecting the colors of the setting sun. The mother carried a bouquet of white flowers. She stepped to the edge, her hands shaking slightly, and gently placed the flowers in the water. They floated out slowly, carried by the current, a silent farewell. One by one, others followed, dropping flowers, notes, and small tokens into the water. Some prayed, some wept quietly, and others simply stood in silence, letting the moment speak for itself. The 3 children who had found the box were also present. They stood quietly, holding on to each other's hands. Though young, they understood the importance of what they had uncovered. Their innocent curiosity had brought the truth to light, and people in the town would always remember them for it. They didn't feel like heroes, but to the grieving mother and to the entire community they were. The investigators closed the case officially, marking it as an accidental drowning. But for the people in town, it was never just about a file in the records. It was about two lives that mattered, two lives that had touched theirs. They promised never to forget. The mother especially wanted to make sure her daughter and husband's story was not remembered only as tragedy, but as a reminder of love, family, and how precious each moment in life is. Over time, the town found ways to honor them. A bench was placed by the lake with a small plaque engraved with words of remembrance. People would sit there on quiet afternoons watching the water, reflecting on their own loved ones. Children who grew up hearing the story would stop by the bench, curious but respectful, learning not only about what had happened but about the importance of holding family close. The mother found her own way of keeping their memory alive. She started a small tradition in the community. Every summer, she invited families to the lake for a day of fishing and picnics. She wanted people to reclaim the place not as a site of sorrow, but as a place where love and laughter could continue. She believed her husband and daughter would have wanted it that way. The first year only a few families came, but as time passed, more and more joined. The sound of children playing by the water slowly returned. Still, there were quiet nights when the grief washed over her like a wave. She would sit by her window, the ribbon from her daughter framed on the wall nearby, and let the tears fall. Grief doesn't simply vanish, it softens and changes over time. She learned to live with it, to let it become part of her without letting it destroy her. On those nights, she would whisper to them, telling them how much she missed them, how much she loved them, and how she hoped they had found peace together. The story of the father and daughter spread beyond the town. Newspapers picked it up again, telling how the discovery of a simple box by 3 children had finally solved a mystery. People far away wrote letters to the mother, some sharing their own experiences of loss, others simply offering comfort. She read every letter, amazed at how many hearts her family's story had touched. The town, once shadowed by the mystery, now carried a new lesson. It reminded everyone of how fragile life can be, how one ordinary day can change everything. But it also reminded them of resilience, the resilience of a mother who never gave up hope, of children who stumbled upon the truth, and of a community that came together when it mattered most. Years later, people still remembered. Parents told their children the story, not to frighten them but to remind them of the importance of caution, love, and gratitude. The bench by the lake remained a quiet place of reflection, where flowers often appeared left by strangers and friends alike. The current of the creek still flowed strong, but now it carried not just the memory of tragedy but also the memory of healing. For the mother, life continued. She grew older, but her love for her family never faded. She kept their pictures close, she spoke about them often, and she lived in a way that honored their memory. Though they were gone, she carried them with her in every step, in every word, in every quiet moment of reflection. The story ended not with despair, but with a kind of peace. It was not the ending anyone would have wished for, but it was an ending that brought answers, closure, and the chance to finally let go of years of questions. The father and daughter's lives, though cut short, had left an impact far greater than anyone could have imagined. And as the flowers drifted across the lake that evening, carried by the same current that had once taken them away, it felt as though the town, the mother, and even the earth itself was whispering the same truth. Love endures even when life does not.